I'm Scott Simmy, and on today's edition of our Soundbite micro podcast, I'm pleased to be joined by Nigel Fisher. Now, Nigel was an Assistant Secretary General in the United Nations, and he's had really a remarkable career that has taken him around the world. He's an officer of the Order of Canada, a recipient of the Meritorious Service Cross, and of the Order of Ontario. He's been awarded an honorary doctorate by McMaster University, his alma mater, and these days, he's an adjunct professor at UBC and is also, finally, a senior advisor to InDro Robotics. Welcome, Nigel.
Hi, Scott. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, you've covered a lot of ground in your life, literally, and we have a lot of ground to cover today, but much of your career has focused on high-level international aid in various positions with the United Nations. Could you give us kind of a high-level overview of that career?
Sure. Well, I spent a couple of decades with UNICEF working on social development programs for children. But several of the countries I worked in were either in the middle of armed conflict, emerging from it, or seemed to be heading towards it. So I became increasingly involved in initiatives to protect children and women in violent situations. I was in Mozambique, Yemen, Iraq, post-genocide Rwanda, post-9/11 Afghanistan. I found the work tough, but I also found it meaningful. I ended my UN career as a UN's regional humanitarian coordinator for a chunk of Syria and then the surrounding refugee-receiving countries during the Syrian civil war. So I'd say I've spent much of my career making my way to places that sensible people were leaving.
Now, we could spend nearly an entire episode simply listing the various countries that you've worked in, but I'd like to drill in on a few of your posts, and you just touched on one of them. You led UNICEF's post-genocide reconstruction efforts in Rwanda in 1994. What did you do there, and how difficult was the task?
That was a Dickensian situation. Definitely the worst of times, but also the best in terms of some of the things we could do. I arrived in the last month of the genocide, and it really was awful. We'd lost so many Rwandan colleagues and family members. I was leading the UNICEF team, but we had to build again, almost from scratch. I think UNICEF is mainly known for its social development work for kids, healthcare, nutrition, education, water supply, sanitation, and also child protection from abuse. And we had all of those programs in Rwanda. But we also did a number of things with the new government that were mostly firsts, I would say, for UNICEF at the time. We had an extensive child trauma counseling program, not surprising given the genocide. Then we had a huge photo tracing program for about 120,000 kids, 120,000 who'd been orphaned or separated from their families during the genocide. Then demobilizing child soldiers from the National Army. We even got involved in restoring hydroelectric power. I think that's the only time in UNICEF's history. And one of the more somber collaborations was we even supported the government in their search for and mapping of mass graves. So it was quite I would say a traumatic, but also a marvelous experience in terms of the new things we could do.
Now, I don't want to pry too much, but I'm assuming that working in Rwanda must have taken quite a toll on you. If you're comfortable talking about that, what impact did it have on you?
Well, after I left behind the high of doing all these amazing things with a truly wonderful team, the overwhelming emotions reasserted themselves, and I became depressed. I couldn't talk about the experience without breaking down. Luckily, I guess, I'd trained in trauma counseling myself, and then the trauma psychologists who would work with me helped me to climb out of that hole.
Nigel, I really truly can't imagine what that must have been like, and I so appreciate you sharing that. Now, you were also dispatched to Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks, where you spent several years in different senior roles, including coordinating humanitarian and reconstruction operations for UN agencies and their many, many partners. Tell us a bit about your time in Afghanistan.
Well, I'd say the usual coordination work involving many programs and many thousands of staff, but a couple of things I'd like to highlight. One is we had a massive demining program. It involved hundreds of deminers to clear up a huge number of anti-personnel landmines and unexploded ordnance all over the country. I should say Afghans are still getting wounded and killed by these today. When I think back, what a difference InDro's robotic flails would have made if we'd had them then. One of the other most vivid memories I have is of the president of Afghanistan, President Karzai, in tears on the day that children went back to school. 3 million of them, and half of them were girls. And bear in mind, this is in a country where the Taliban had forbidden girls' education before. So it's really sad now that Afghanistan has reverted to that under the Taliban again today, 20 years later. Maybe I should add an interesting sidebar. I was also the UN's designated security official, which means I was responsible for the security and safety of all the civilian UN staff throughout Afghanistan. So meeting with international military, national security officials on a regular basis. And I can tell you, drones would have certainly helped our security assessments then.
You also spent several years from 2010 to 2013 in Haiti, again in multiple roles, including coordinating the UN's humanitarian and reconstruction efforts following that absolutely devastating 2010 earthquake. I understand that's where you first saw a drone in action. Tell us about that.
Yeah, one of the agencies involved was responsible for building camps and shelters for displaced people. And they brought in a couple of drones, first time I'd seen them, to try them out. They were locating groups of displaced people or monitoring camp construction and services. And they even eventually to monitor who was staying in camps and who were leaving. I really saw this immediately as a game changer and started to think this could help us access hard to reach areas and people, help us assess damage, help with security. I'd say that's the positive side. I was in Nepal a few years later, in 2015, after their devastating earthquake. And I saw another side of the drone business, and dozens of well-meaning external agencies brought in drones which were buzzing all over the place, unauthorized, uncoordinated, even threatening airport safety. So the military banned the use of drones at a crucial time until they could register them and get organized. So again, coming back home and getting to know InDro, I was really glad to see it was working with the federal government to establish regulations for safe drone deployment.
Now, drones and ground robotics have advanced tremendously in recent years. How important do you see their roles and potential now?
They really are game changers, I would say, both aerial and ground robotics. If you look at a crisis, a disaster, they're invaluable for data collection, damage assessment, reaching hard to reach areas, great research and rescue, especially the search part. And now we're seeing that they're great for flying emergency supplies and medical equipment to remote or inaccessible areas. That's mainly the drone side. But for ground robotics, I've mentioned mine clearance, and I see a huge potential in humanitarian work for self-driving vehicles to deliver humanitarian supplies to civilians in dangerous areas, high conflict zones. And I understand right now, InDro is looking into robotics in support of remote health services. So to me, this is marvelous, not only for countries in conflict, but for also just countries with poverty, with remote populations. So many good uses.
The federal government recently announced its Defense Industrial Strategy, or DIS. Now, it commits more than $500 billion over the next decade to increase our defense and sovereignty capabilities while reducing reliance on foreign contractors. What's your take on the implications for the Canadian tech sector?
Well, I think it's great that Ottawa has recognized the changing geopolitical dynamics around the world, and that for our defense and our emergency services, we need to rely less on others. I think for robotics, tech, unprecedented opportunities, and particularly for ground robots and drones.
You've literally had boots on the ground, and I'm talking about your own personal pair of boots in some 13 different countries. Now, those battered boots are now in the Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto. Why did they wind up there, and what do they represent to you?
Well, back in about 2009, UNICEF Canada, which I was heading at the time, was using my well-worn pair of field boots as the centerpiece for a fundraising campaign. And the tagline went something like, "These boots have saved X," I can't remember the precise number, 100,000 lives. Join us to save a life. So apparently the Bata Shoe Museum folks saw this. And the next thing we knew, they wanted the boots for their collection. I'd say something of a change from their normal high fashion. So they organized a big event to induct my boots into the museum, and which were proudly displayed on a pedestal. By this time, I'd already left for Haiti and the earthquake response. So my wife represented me, and I was able to join by video from Port-au-Prince. Late, I should add, so I panicked them for a while till I joined.
I'm going to switch topics literally by 180 degrees. I understand you met actor-director Sean Penn during your work and became friends, and that resulted in a brief career change. So tell us about that.
I met Sean in Haiti, where he organized several camps for people displaced by the earthquake. And for some reason, early on, he came to the conclusion that I wasn't your typical UN bureaucrat, and we became friends. No, he eventually sent me the script for a film he was planning to direct, a story of love amidst civil wars in West Africa. Would I look it over? Did it seem realistic? So I sent him back a lot of comments. And next thing I knew, he offered me a small part as supervisor of a UN human rights worker, who was played by Charlize Theron. Well, why not? And the set for the movie was in Cape Town, so off I went. 5 minutes of fame. I sat with Sean a lot next to his director's chair to watch how a movie director directs. And that movie was called The Last Face. Well, surprise, surprise, a few years later, he called me again. And this time for a movie called Flag Day. Again, a small role. And this time the movie was shot in Winnipeg and pretending to be University of Minnesota. So it wasn't quite as exotic as Cape Town.
Nigel Fisher, it's been absolutely fascinating speaking with you today. I wish we could do multiple episodes, so I do foresee a sequel down the road. Thank you so much for your time and for your incredible service.
Thank you, Scott. I really enjoyed doing the podcast with you. I must say, it was a lot to pack in a few minutes, but I hope it makes sense to the people listening.